complicated, you know, man. It's like a dang Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, Mr. D, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
I'm reasonably well, Mr. Burden. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you back on. As I was saying to you backstage, our last episode is one of my personal favorites. And so obviously, you know, I figure, you know, what's more reliable than capturing lightning in a bottle twice? And so I had you back on.
That's very sweet. You may not, you may only get like sparks this time. I don't know. Lightning strikes, you know, are quite unpredictable, aren't they?
No. As the youth are often say, it's different for me, right? Anyway. So Mr. D, in addition to just, you know, enjoying talking to you, which is definitely part of it, I wanted to have you on to discuss kind of the resurgence of, you know, the American question. You know, you obviously are a Britisher yourself. And so I'm curious, right? There's kind of two main, you know, like thrusts of this, which is one, you know, is there such a thing as, you know, American identity? And then two is, you know, is America the great Satan? So I'm curious, from kind of a outsider's perspective, what is your, you know, kind of general opinion on American identity?
Well, I first should certainly clear things up. I mean, I don't really consider myself an outsider because I've lived in that particular place for many years. I spent quite a number of years there in the 90s and 2000s, and now again. And of course, I spent lots of time traveling here, you know, at various parts of my childhood. So I don't really think of myself as an outsider. I mean, if I may be so bold to say that, but I do feel like I have quite a sort of history and quite an attachment to your great nation. So I think my perspective is going to sort of come from there. I mean, obviously I would say my deep sort of general outlook is probably, you know, is probably not, is as you say, is probably a British one, in one way or the other. But, you know, yeah, for good or for ill, I was born into a class of, you know, quasi-rootless cosmopolitans. So I did spend a lot of time in both places.
Well, and there's sort of there's a long tradition of that, right? You know, the transatlantic elite have existed for quite some time. And it's sort of and this is very much kind of the thesis of Albion Seed, right? Is that there is a sense to which kind of the original American identity was kind of was tied up with being an Anglo, and sort of the wars which rocked England kind of came here to be fought a second time. And part of that is that, you know, and this is what's difficult, right? Is that when we talk about America, what are we talking about? Because we're sort of, you know, much like the French on a series of republics. So I'm curious, right? And you mentioned that you're kind of straddling the line here, but do you see any sort of kind of holdovers from English culture kind of still in America?
Oh, obviously. I mean, you know, there's a reason why I believe that the, you know, the Declaration of Independence uses the word consanguinity to talk about the relationship between, you know, between at that time, you know, the British, the proper British and the then colonists, you know, prior to the U.S. Revolution. You know, and of course, yes. I mean, we obviously share blood. We share, at least we did, the foundations of a kind of, you know, of a kind of deep culture. And it depends on where you go in the U.S. I mean, obviously there was, you know, I think that the Southern sort of tradition, the patrician aristocratic tradition, which you saw in so many of the founders of America. is very much a kind of import, in a way, from from a British system. But obviously, yes. I mean, we share a language, so and we share at least to some degree cultural roots, and then you also go into other parts of the Southern America, and you get, as you say, Albion Siege. You get the sort of the deep influence of Scots Irish, Celtic. You get the Welsh, who came to Pennsylvania in great numbers at various periods. So yes, obviously we're all sort of seeded through. Now, of course, the problem is that we have both been battered by the 20th century and by modernity and now post-modernity, and of course there is a great sort of caustic substance eating away at our sense of culture, whether it be American or British. So I do think we're in a battle. We imagine we're in sort of a battle against each other, but really we're both fighting the same enemies. Hence why I do get very sensitive about this topic when there is sort of disagreement, because I just don't see how anyone could deny, again, the kind of whatever the differences, that the obvious rootedness that we have together.
And I think it's sort of a difficult thing to place, right? Which is that this empire that we're fighting against, right? I think the line is from, I want to say it's Dave who came up with this, but who knows? It may have come from somewhere else, right? That this great like acid of modernity will essentially, take whatever you love, hollow it out, and wear it like a skin suit. And I sort of see, and it's hard because there's this back and forth between people saying like, oh, whatever you want to call the toxic, kind of modern inversion of hierarchy, right? The woke, whatever. That is, a product of America. And to me, the problem with that is that, well, one, it's sort of difficult to separate, a specific nation's corruption from kind of civilizational corruption, right? That the West as a whole was sort of entering into it was sort of coming apart at the seams, independent of, one specific nation. And when I look inside the borders of my own country, right, I see the same disintegration, the same leveling happen within its own borders just as much as anywhere else. And so saying like, oh, this is the fault of, Uncle Sam, it's to me, it seems a little bit limited, right? It's that there's this kind of deep civilizational corruption. And maybe the worst you could say about us is that we were, when the music stopped, we were sort of holding the bag, if that makes sense. Do you see what I'm getting at there, or is that too vague?
No, I see what you're getting at. I think this is a very important distinction to make, because I think that there is a lot of confusion. Where does how does the kind of spirit and culture of a nation or a people, how does it different from those who rule over it? I think that the idea that we that Britain operates as a kind of parliamentary system, and that America operates as a republic, and that it operates as a sort of, that your legislature or parliament in the case of Britain, that they operate as a kind of responsive voice of their people and their nation. I mean, I think that's been patently false for a very long time. And so the question then becomes, well, to what degree are these the actions of a particular nation or a particular people, and to what degree are they the actions of, again, as we've come to say, a regime or a ruling class or a so-called elite, and to what degree are people culpable? I think it's, you get into a very difficult system when, of course, I think most people in our spaces can agree that that there is a serious problem with the rule over our various nations in the West, a serious problem with again those so-called elites, those the whatever constitutes these various regimes. But it's difficult then to sort of blame that necessarily on the people, especially, of course, again, as so many people in our circles have a great distrust and quite a cynical attitude about the idea of democracy, the idea that it ever sort of operated in the way that it says it does. So again, it's difficult to then figure out how you turn that around on a people, on the spirit of a people, I mean, I believe firmly that at some point in the past, and the point, of course, is variable. It depends when you think the corruption started. I think it started much earlier than most people do. Certainly can easily be pinpointed in the beginning of the 20th century. But at what point did you is the will of a people, is the will of a nation decoupled from the way that nation operates in the world through its rulers? So I think maybe that what you were getting at.
No, it is. And I guess let me present to you an argument that I've heard, because I sort of find myself in an uncomfortable position of being an American Protestant who reads quite a lot of Catholic reactionaries. And one of the things that I've heard before as an argument is that America is a country entirely of the Enlightenment, that there is no pre-existing culture of kind of an earlier social order. And so because it has none of that traditional mooring, right, doesn't have the same sort of ethnos, the same sort of pre-Enlightenment culture. It was sort of doomed from the start. So how would you respond to that argument?
Well, that's clearly bollocks. I mean, it's clearly bollocks. I mean, I've always been quite interested in early American history. For what in one way or the other. I mean, certainly as as an artistic venture, as someone interested in architecture, someone interested in in sort of human culture and civilization, and with any cursory look, the United States has roots, or even what you call the pre-United States has roots that are far deeper and much older than the Enlightenment. And I do think that you mentioned the word, you mentioned being a Protestant. Well, I think that there is certainly a much better case to say that the roots of the American experiment were not Enlightenment roots, but they were the roots of a particular Protestant sect and the particular Protestant mindset. Now, those sort of ancient beliefs of the Pilgrim Fathers and such, and the sort of tendencies of the early colonists may have then fed into these sort of much later Enlightenment values. But no, it's clear that there was a deep sort of frontier / colonial character that preceded in European Enlightenment by a very long period of time, and really that didn't become sort of, the thing is, the United States prior to the sort of mid 18th century didn't really, like, sort of intellectual culture was beside the point. When you're building a civilization, you're not at the phase where you're kind of playing with ideas, and you're not at the phase where you're sort of analyzing where you are or what you are. You're too busy, surviving and thriving and expanding and exploring, And so, of course, I think that was a very deep influence on kind of what we think of as the American character. But I think all those things happened long before the Enlightenment ever became a sort of issue. It really wasn't until the later 18th century that you even had, as I say, really a kind of burgeoning intellectual culture. And you see it with, of course, the founders, various people, specifically, especially the more kind of intellectual, bookish ones like Jefferson or Franklin, with his interest in the natural sciences, and in Washington, who was sort of looking into the classics as they relate to martial affairs. No, I think it's kind of nonsense to say that the founding of America, which stretched all the way back to the beginning of the 17th century, had anything to do with the Enlightenment at all.
One of the things that has been interesting, and I've been discussing this in kind of a extended series on slavery with George Bagby, is how the pre-bellum South had genuinely a sort of antiquated social structure. The manner, right? And obviously this was a minority. This was the extreme upper class. Were in a way sort of patriarchs. They were a social order that was kind of outside of what you saw anywhere else in the world, where it was a large family headed up by a man, and each one of these plantations was sort of its own settlement, right? Obviously there were slaves, there were servants, there were industry kind of wholly confined to this area. And so in a way, it's almost sort of the image that he used to describe it is it's almost sort of a barony, right? That it's an older organization. And when that is overthrown, it's overthrown by something that, continental Europe would be very familiar with. The difference between, Lincoln and kind of, 1848 style nationalism, kind of refined into something like, Bismarck or Garibaldi is they're sort of, they share a lot in common. And so to me, this is what I'm talking about. And maybe you look at, kind of 19th century, nationalism and you personally identify with that, which fair enough. But to me, from my perspective, I see that as sort of a precursor of our current corruption. And so to say, well, okay, it's the fault of the red, white, and blue, it sort of, to me, seems a little bit short-sighted, right? That there are trends going on, much, much deeper than just the 20th century. That's at least how I see it.
No, I think you're right, and I certainly don't. When I talk about nation, I'm not really talking about that. Yes, that style of nationalism that sort of crystallized in the 19th century, and of course, yes. I mean, I think that obviously, I mean, for me, I say the beginning of the 20th century, around 1913. I mean, I think that most people could certainly look into things and find an obvious change, but I do think that, of course, a broader kind of change was happening and that grew out of the 19th century, which I think some of the worst things to afflict human civilization were born in the 19th century, and I do think that things such as, of course, the Industrial Revolution, it changed the entire kind of way that that men saw each other and thought about what it meant to rule over each other. Suddenly things, everything's, people started to just see dollar signs and everything, and suddenly everything started to become more attractive as a commodity, and I think that there is certainly causative, threads within this sort of change in the way we view the world and ourselves and our fellow men that happened after the beginning of great industrialization. And it happened in Europe, and it happened in America, happened all over the place. And and I think that if you're an astute student of history, which I'm not so much, but you can certainly look in and find like detailed sort of examples of how these things changed. And I think that there arose a kind of man, a class of man, that this was the kind of inception of the aspirational upper middle, the sort of stratospheric empowerment of the merchant, of the tycoon, the businessman. All these kind of archetypes were born at that era, and these are men who started to see that all of these old ways of kind of organizing the world, whether they be monarchy or aristocracy or enculturation, race, roots, whatever, these were all impediments to this new world of speed and steam and money, that they wanted to bring into existence. And so these things stood in the way, and they needed to be knocked down, and they were, and so you're right. I think that the problems of the current day are certainly rooted in in that period of time.
Well, and that's why, and I'll be the first to admit that as much as I try to read, as much as I try to only kind of remark on topics which I'm actually familiar with, I have not read Hegel. I find him completely incomprehensible. But whether you want to call it the the zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, or providence, there is sort of and this is something that especially circles who are very versed in cyclical history should be familiar with, that there is kind of an essence to the age. There are these kind of civilizational moments of optimism or pessimism, and in much the same way that figures like Ezra Pound or poems like The Wasteland sort of fall out of fashion when broader civilization or when culture has kind of stepped away from that feeling. The idea that this turn to first through mercantilism, then to capitalism, then to managerialism, was this kind of absurd thing where it's like, and then someone decided to do it. Like someone woke up one day and invented evil capitalism and basically said, like, in order to be American, you must do this, right? It's sort of this inevitable arms race, right? And especially if we consider ourselves political realists, which I consider myself, it's one of those things where it's like, well, it's like the levee en masse, right? That once it's sort of loosed on the world, it's Pandora's box. You can't go back from it, and so to me, I guess I get frustrated because I have no love for the American empire, death to the empire, whatever. But the idea that, because empire exists and because someone has, seized the reins of power, it's sort of a unique kind of moral shame upon people who live within the empire. To me, I just don't find that convincing.
No, it's stupid. I mean, but that's the sort of blood libel that, that now we just reach for at the drop of a hat, I mean, most people, the vast majority of people who have ever lived, they float upon, they didn't build a river, they were born into a river, the river of their time and their culture, which they float upon, and they are not in control. They're not in control of the speed of the river, the height of the waves, whatever. They're just there bobbing along, surviving until they go under, and so to ascribe kind of culpability, because again, if we believe that there are great men, if we believe that there are terrible men, if we believe in elite theory at all, then I don't see how you can sort of then ascribe these great sort of trends in the exercising of power as having anything really culpably to do with with the average person. So but I certainly agree with you that empire, the modern empire has been an absolute disaster. I mean, maybe more controversially for me, because I think the British Empire was an absolute disaster and it should never have happened, certainly in the way that it happened. And then once it did happen, it should have never been allowed to slip away. Whether it slipped away or whether it was deliberately pushed in the direction it was is a question for another time. But yes, I mean, when a sort of there is a sort of just great change, great sort of ontological change that happens when especially a people like the Americans, a sort of nation like America goes from building itself on the inside to directing itself outward, then I think you've really lost the so-called people that are meant to be in charge of the direction of their own country, and something has really gone off the rails. So yeah.
So I'm curious. Can you speak more about that? So why are you anti-British Empire to begin with, and then secondly, why did you say that the way it was run, it never should have been run? I'm curious what you mean by that. Well,
how to say this without being too spicy? I mean, I think that unless you're prepared in perpetuity to rule over distant peoples, distant lands, with an absolute iron fist. Eventually, because I think rooted, I mean, we've heard the concept of white man's burden, from Kipling and obviously elsewhere. Once you have accepted a paternalistic relationship with your empire, then that child is going to grow up into a beast, and it's going to murder you in the end, because you will not be able to control it. If you take that model, that paternal or / maternal model, and apply it to empire, eventually as I say, the child grows out of your control, and unless you're prepared to be an absolute martinet, which the British weren't, to our credit and perhaps to our shame, it grew from a child into a great beast that we could no longer control, and then of course it's going to be a financial drain, it's going to be a cultural drain, and then of course when you introduce this deep bottleneck of intellectual rot and cowardice that befell the loss of so many great men within a very short period of time, then you're left with the crawling managers, and they're very happy to sell you for the pennies to the pound. So that's the sort of my dissatisfaction with the idea of empire. Unless you intend to have an empire in a serious way, and really make it your empire, the empire of your people, then it's if as soon as you get a weak generation, it's all going to come back and bite you. I would rather have a seriously strong country for my own people, for those of my kind, and concern ourselves with our own fortune and favor.
That reminds me of, this is a point that that Foucault makes about capital punishment, which is that when you look at kind of a confident civilization, it is fully comfortable handing out the death penalty. That you have attempted on the king's life, you will be torn to bits, and your body will be paraded around on display and pickled, right? And obviously, maybe we could have some qualms. We're a little bit more merciful nowadays, but nonetheless, right, there is kind of a vital confidence to that. And I think that there's something to that the will to violence and the will to rule are two sides of the same coin. And once you lose that, even in as mild a way as looking at empire as this sort of missionary effort, you're sort of starting to lose the ability to defend it. And I find myself in agreement. I despite my more reactionary tendencies, belong to the kind of tradition that comes out of the old American right. Garrett, kind of the Southern conservatives, that tradition. It's something that I consider myself a part of, and that is very much connected to anti-imperialism. It's been branded as anti-interventionism. And I think that what we've seen, with England and what we're seeing with America, it is sort of that, the devil's bargain is coming due, and the mortgage that was empire, your empire or ours, those chickens are quite literally coming home to roost and are kind of in turn, laying waste to kind of the seat of the empire. So I think you're onto something there.
Chickens, they're more like velociraptors,
Well, I was being generous.
well beyond chickens to this point. But no, I certainly agree with you. But as you, to the point about that lost the sort of the masculine urges, the will to violence. When you have reimagined your humanity as just a bunch of merchants, as a bunch of people selling, buying, that is the be all and end all. There is no transcendence. There is no metaphysics. There's the. I'm not going to launch into the speech from Network. That Ned Beatty's speech from Network. You, have meddle with the forces of nature, Mr. Beale. And of course, where his summation of the modern world, which is in that speech, is why it's still so resonant and brilliant. This is absolutely true. We've everyone, and certainly in the West, has decided that the highest value is a dollar, is a share, is a stock, is something that you can sell. And so when you're a people who have decided that is your highest value, then you're not gonna be warriors. You can't run a shop if you're slashing everyone who enters with a sword. So you just become a shopkeeper, and of course eventually you degrade from a shopkeeper into a prostitute, where you're willing to degrade every sort of foundation and moral for a few bob. And of course I think that's as one of the reasons I am not terribly fond of Thatcherism, because it was basically selling the seed corn, selling all the kind of stock in greater things that we had built up for so long, to the highest bidder.
Well, and again, I don't mean to keep harping on the American Civil War, but I've said before that I love the South, and one of the many things I love about where I live is these beautiful decaying manor homes, right? And some of them have luckily been well preserved. But if you've ever watched probably one of my favorite movies, right, Gone with the Wind, there is the symbol of the carpetbagger, right, which is when this kind of old antiquated civilization, and look, like, I'll be the first one to admit that the South was behind the times, whether for good or for ill. And when that is swept away, who comes in afterwards, right? The man there to basically give you pennies on the dollar for your property, turn you out, and instead of being passed through to your patrimony, it's essentially pissed up the wall, right? And in its place is what you said, that kind of like view of man as this integer. And look, don't get me wrong, like there was a free trade streak in the American South. Infamously, that was sort of why we were on good terms with England, right? Is that there was trade. And so I'm not trying to point this out as this like, kind of like this kind of like medieval, protectionist versus, the evil, northern capitalist. Not my point. But saying that there was sort of that again, going back to that almost that, and sorry, I'm stumbling over my words here, but that idea you talk about, right, of viewing the man as a dollar, right, viewing everything as a metric. The worst part about it is that it worked, that it was more effective, it was more efficient. But again, much like empire, it was a devil's bargain. And so when I look at the corruption that both of our cultures are kind of finding themselves weighed down by, there's a part of it that it is, and maybe this is me reading too much Old Testament, but it's sort of like it's a perspective from which it's our own just deserts. And I'm not trying to sound overly black-pilled, but that's at least a thought that I've had.
Well, of course, I mean, again, I'm not going to assign culpability to most people, because, of course, these things are out of the ken and control of most people. But yes, I mean, obviously, and even if you want to sort of remove a direct religious reference, it worked, but it worked at what cost? It's just like, well, you've got an engine, and the oil is very low, but you may be able to get home, but of course by the time you get home your engine's going to be glowing and it's going to be totally wrecked. So it's just like, well, okay, you can get this or that, you can get rich, you can take over the world in one way or the other, but at what cost? And of course it's the cost of your own soul. And when these things will manifest themselves, it's the fruit of a poison tree. I mean, if you plant evil, poison seeds, it will grow into a great plant that will then produce lots more poison fruit, which will kill you when you eat them. And that's what we're getting, even if people won't agree with it, even if they want to say, oh, no, we've left all that rubbish. We're modern men now. No, I mean, all of the kind of horrors that we're seeing, all the kind of misery in the Western world, all this degradation and decay and collapse, is because we have fundamentally gone against the primal forces of nature, as Ned Beatty's character said in Network. And yes, it's going to manifest itself in a terrible way, and it doesn't matter how much you deny it. It doesn't matter how much you point to, well, my GDP, my whatever. Doesn't matter. You're dying and you're rotting from the inside out, and we see it. We're living in it. We're suffering so much from it. And it may be able to go on. The worst part is that this broken system, this just horrible path that people have chosen for us, it could limp on for decades. We have no idea how long it's going to go on. But eventually it will fall apart. It is not viable in the long term. So
one of the things that, and this is a separate conversation, is about the spread of Americanized culture, and is this kind of the vector of that corruption that you're talking about. And again, I think it's difficult because you were an artist. You and I have talked about art before, and obviously everyone has a certain resonance with art that comes from their home and comes from their people. But to me, the idea that, again, that type of corruption, right, that like deep, kind of like bone deep rot, is essentially the product of the last 60 to 70 years of American cultural output. Is, I mean, to be honest, I find it laughable. And on the back end, the thing that, and very few things I think offend me on the internet, I try not to let it. But the kind of discourse of, kind of American culture as exclusively urban, I'll put it, is something that I don't find convincing. And when I look at the kind of the genesis of uniquely American art, like maybe we could say it's Hawthorne, maybe a few other writers, maybe Whitman, I don't know. Everyone has their own kind of, pet project on that front. To me, that seems very much a recognizable offspring of European culture. Do you think that there's something there?
I think of course it has deep roots in European culture, obviously, but I also think that there are other things, there's other threads. I mean, again, it is the mindset of people who have no idea about America apart from what they see at the cinema or what they see on television or what they see in terms of popular music, whatever. Well, back when that was sort of a thing. That is the mindset of someone who doesn't actually have any kind of deep familiarity with America. I mean, just as, of course, as an American who had never been to, say, Wales or, France or wherever, and left a kind of metropolitan, overbearing metropolitan, grip and gone to a village, gone to another region. You're just not going to have any idea that anything else exists. And so, of course, it's very easy to create a caricature of America. Now, again, we're talking about merchants here. So, of course, having a kind of very easily identified brand to sell, that's kind of a positive. They don't care. I mean, they don't care if they're steamrolling over this or that or region, sort of regionalism is left out, thrown by the wayside. They don't care about all the damage. Again, they care about what they can sell, and so of course it's easier to sell a product like that. That's quite legible. It's easy. It's digestible. So yeah, that you're going to go for it. But again, I mean, you have to ask yourself, I mean, who are these people? You know, where do they come from? What do they want? What are their kind of motivations? And I think it's a mistake to necessarily, again, make this sort of idea that the products of, you know, Hollywood, the products of various merchants of one sort or the other, is the will of, or a reflection of the spirit of America. It isn't, you know. And again, all of these deep and complicated cultural things, they remain, whether they've been battered and worn and weathered. They're there. You can find them, and the same with, you know, in Britain. You know, you can find all of these sort of ancient things and these subtleties of region, these subtleties of voice and accent and belief and tradition and whatever, you know. And I do think that those things, you know, hopefully they can survive, you know. But I mean, we've all undergone this onslaught, and I'm just suggesting that the onslaught perhaps is something alien. Is something alien to the kind of deep and subtle culture of America or Britain or anywhere where else. But yes, you know. But I do think that even though you could say that certainly for Hawthorne or T.S. Eliot, you know, Ezra Pound, obviously there's deeply sort of European influences there. But I do also think there are other threads, you know, that have been picked up from a unique kind of culture. I think America very early on started to go through its own kind of ethnogenesis. You know, I mean, by the late 19th century, it's unmistakable when you see a picture of an American, you know, or you read a poem that is written by an American. You can almost always tell. And so, you know, I think that, you know, cultures can grow their own roots, so to speak. Can grow their own tributaries apart from the main river. Switching metaphors there, mid-sentence. Sorry.
That's sort of a staple of the show is horribly mixed metaphors, right? So you're in good company.
I love mixing metaphors. Good.
So I'm curious, right? You're a visual artist, and one of the things that you're famous for is a defense of modern, and I use that specifically not as a synonym for contemporary art. And so in that, how do you separate, you know, kind of American modern artists from, I don't know, visual media created to advertise? Because there's obviously a correlation between branding and American modern art. Am I correct in that?
Yes, but I mean, you know, and yes, and obviously, of course, there was a very well-known movement in the middle of the 20th century called pop art, including Andy Warhol, who I did a whole stream series about with AA, which was sort of a kind of inversion. It was saying, well, instead of fighting this, why don't we synthesize it in a way? Why don't we try and see if we can make a synthesis of all of these things, of all of this notion of high and low, which was, you know, obviously always a great concern. You know, well, what is high art? What is low art? You know, what is high culture? What is lowbrow? Well, why don't we try to make a synthesis of them and see what happens? And it was very successful in some cases, you know, and of course, you know, lots of people can argue about what the purpose of art is, whether it's visual art or poetry or song. You know, people get very exercised about visual art for some reason, even though it has almost no effect at all on the culture or anyone's life. I don't know why people get so angry about paintings. And it's funny because, you know, you do it on social media and you end up relitigating these sort of like arguments that happened like 100 years ago. You know, you start getting people arguing about Picasso, and it's just like, it's kind of settled a long time ago. But yes, I mean, there's obviously very great differences in the sort of tendencies of one way or the other. But as I've always said, there is no kind of art world. There is no kind of American art world. There's no kind of British art world. There are worlds within worlds, and there's, depending on what you like and what sort of work you do, there's a whole sort of avenue that you can go down that is distinct and separate from, that there is no kind of giant hegemon. So it's a curious question, but I think all this kind of relates back to, AA has this, I believe it's AA who came up with it, calling himself a postmodern traditionalist. And in a weird way, I sort of humorously take that appellation for myself because, I am, even though my sort of personality and proclivities from a very young age were for, let's just say, more antiquated aspects of culture, these are the sort of things that I tend to have the most resonance with. I listen to lots of pop music, but I've always had a great love for Baroque music, for instance. And so even when I was a child, I tend towards, one way, but I'm also a man who was born in the 1970s and grew up partially shielded from mass culture because of my parents and my upbringing. They sort of very much wanted to limit my exposure to it, and I made up for it later by becoming a hyper American for a while when I first moved to America in the 90s. But but I do think that many of us sort of have to live in this contradiction, and it can be a great source. It can be a great inspiration living in living in both of these worlds at once. We yearn for the past, we love the forms of the past, but we're also sort of living in a certain condition, and we've come to love things. Perhaps we shouldn't. Perhaps we should. Both Academic Agent and I are great sort of fans of roadside Americana. We did, and again, referring back to another stream series we did of this sort of vernacular photographer called John Margulies, who spent decades just driving around America every summer and taking photographs of mostly kind of vernacular architecture, pop culture, signage, half of which was, of course, a ruin, even back then. But AA and I both love this stuff, and so of course the question is, well, I can also love Veronese or Correggio or someone like that, Fra Angelico, but still I can also love a rusted neon sign of an ice cream cone. And so I do like that idea that we, of course, yearn for the past, but live and find beauty in the ashes as well. I've strayed well off your question,
no, not at all. To me, it brings up something that I think about often when it comes to religion. That one of the poisons of modernity is the idea that in these kind of deep bonds are essentially optional and kind of like swappable at your will. That I've decided as I've decided that I am actually not a Southern American Protestant. That really I am a Carlist, right? That's what I am. And we see a lot of that on the internet, but obviously, there's more pernicious ones, right? I've decided that I am a woman. You must address me as such. But you see it as well with, kind of with kind of culture and identity more broadly, right? That what may have started as something kind of like, innocuous has obviously metastasized. But to me, there's something about that, which is that one of the benefits of religion is this idea of subjecting yourself to a will not your own. That I don't choose this. I don't choose what strictures to follow. It's all or nothing. And when it comes to nationality and ethnos, there's a part of that, right? That there are parts that if rationally I was sitting out, with a pen and paper, designing my ideal culture or designing my ideal ethnos, there are things that I would choose maybe that, my group of people didn't have. But nonetheless, right, that it's not worth anything unless you're kind of in for a penny, in for a pound. And so to me, when I consider, our kind of broad group of friends on whatever you want to call this circle, right? The right, the E-right, the dissonant right, whatever that is. I think that if this is going to be a productive group, there sort of need to be certain things that are kind of considered below the belt. And my I guess suggestion for that would be those kind of first loyalties, right? When it comes to nationality and family and faith, right? Those things which are rightfully considered kind of core attributes of, what it is to be a man. And so to me, right, the kind of dialogue that results from, look, I've, made fun of someone's faith, or I've made fun of someone's fatherland, right? And look at how badly they reacted. It's sort of like, well, yes, you'd hope they would. Like if I walk into I don't know where Parisians spend their time, I think smoking on the street and having affairs, right? But if I walked into
in the pissoir, yes,
yeah, if I could go into a place for such a thing and said that, that my honest opinions on Paris or the French, right? It would be a good thing if I were punched in the nose, right? Like that is a good and natural human reaction. And so to me, I guess there's sort of this need to balance kind of a realistic look at, the state of our culture, and also that, much like we talked about with empire and with that, you sort of need to be confident in that, that if everything is, kind of like rational and mathematical, it sort of loses the living spirit in it. Do you see anything in that, or is this just me rambling?
No, I would certainly agree. I mean, see, I cannot say that my opinions are because I'm abnormal. I've always been abnormal. Whether whatever you call it, Asperger's syndrome, or just my eclectic nature, or my incurable curiosity about things. But I have never sort of seen the world in that way, or certainly never seen the kind of West in that way. I have, maybe it's a kind of artifact of the fact that I was all over the place and, again, to some degree ruthless. But, it just never occurs to me. I'm very interested in immersing, visiting a town, or visiting a person that I like, and just immersing myself in their ways, and the same with art. I have certainly things that I like, that I sort of favor. But I'm very interested in, of course, how the French conceived of things, how the French conceived of landscape or portraiture, how the Spanish did it, and I don't really I don't do the tier list, I just don't think of things in that way. It's like this current, again, ratings bonanza, which is all it is. One of the things I hate so much about, new Twitter, whatever they're calling it these days, is that, people should have seen what monetization would do. As if the discourse on Twitter wasn't bad enough. But now, of course, everyone is just trying to make a buck. Again, diluting everything and boiling everything down to how much you can make. Opinions, aesthetics, morals, everything be damned. And so now people are just content farming. They're trying to get the most engagement, the most views. They're trying to get lots of anger and replies, because of course that works very well for views and engagement. So you get someone saying, oh, your food is slop. The best thing ever invented in the world is the fucking Yorkshire pudding. Look, I'm eating a Sunday roast and a Yorkshire pudding. I'm a real British person. Well, fuck off. I love it. Obviously love it. That food, and would eat that very happily over almost anything else. But again, I'm not going to sort of jump on someone else's conception of cuisine or taste, or what someone else does with their local ingredients, or what someone else's culture has come up with as a way to kind of feed, because most food that we think about, most sort of cuisine cultures, are the culture of the kind of, not so much peasants, but of the lower sort, of the people who worked, And so, of course, national cuisines tend to be reflections on that, and I love it. I adore French food. That's how I sort of learned to cook. And there's many different types of food, French food there. But it's not my nature to sort of have this weird kind of I don't know, these weird kind of assertions to sort of attack people over those kind of differences. It just isn't in my nature. So, but I don't know how common that is. Maybe people like that. Maybe that's what people want to do, and that's what makes people feel good. But again, I am just primarily drawn to all of the glories of God's creation. And I will find beauty however or wherever I can find it. And one of the things that makes the toils and sufferings of life bearable, is finding the beauty of God's creation in everything, which you can find it if you look. So yeah, I think I have a different conception of these things, but I do think it's entirely unproductive. The greatest thing our enemy, and I say enemy with a capital E because I'm one of those people who believes that this is good and evil. Fundamentally, these battles we're fighting are good and evil. We're fighting against an adversary in the biblical sense. The greatest pleasure for this adversary is for us to just, is for people who agree on most things to start bickering, I know I always go back to Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings, but I think one of the fundamental points of the Fellowship is that these were races who hated each other, some of them. These were races who had never cooperated before. And there was no sort of, there isn't this modern affliction of just saying, we're all one, we're all equal. Well, they weren't. They all had skills, they all had strengths, and they were brought together to fight a great adversary, to fight a sort of overarching foe that imperiled all of them, And I think it's just very important to remember this. There is just no reason for us to pick fights amongst ourselves,
Well, and it ties in with that theme of, monetization and metric, turning something into a metric, corrupting the true soul of it. That in a way, the mass demonetization of our guys, right? The fact that Anons really couldn't make a buck until, probably Substack, right? It sort of refined us, as a group, because there was no really profitable grift, right? The grift was, the skeptic sphere, the rational centrists, right? And once, Elon and you and I share feelings on Elon, Mr. D. Once he kind of
Mr. Musk. Actually, it's funny. I've got a draft tweet because one of the things that irks me so much is this, that we have been psyoped into referring to all of these titans of industry and politicians. We've been psyoped into referring to them by their Christian names as if that they're our friends. I know I understand why you do it, but I do urge people. There is a psychological distance that you get by calling someone by their surname, and try it, because again, you know me, that Elon, I have said it for a long time that he is not your friend.
Yes, fair enough. That Elon Reeve Musk, right, sort of dropped. I'm sorry, that was incredibly pedantic, but I couldn't resist.
It's good.
He sort of dropped a lit match into our circles by opening up that window of monetization, and monetization by engagement, right? Not through kind of, the Substack model, which is, well, you have something interesting to say, I'll pay you for it, but just simply by getting more clicks, more eyes. And so the same type of bad behavior that it's very easy to kind of point out and, dismiss when you see it on TikTok, right? Of these TikTok stars doing, reprehensible things to increase clicks. Well, in our circles, right, the moment that, Daddy Elon basically says like, oh, here's $150 at the end of the month, that same circus, it comes home. And it is saddening, but not surprising.
Yes, of course, it's not surprising because, again, this is how we've decided that civilization, that this is the end state of civilization, where everything is a product, and everything will be marketed as a product. Everyone will, and we're now in this just absolutely cursed phase where just, people think of themselves, the word influencer, I'm a content creator. Everyone is their own little merchant, and everyone is their own little HR department. And, and again, all of these, and the thing I said earlier is that there's nothing a kind of salesman likes better than a product that is very easily defined, very easy to sell. I mean, this is why, processed food is does so well, because it is designed to be easy. It's easy to eat. It's satisfying, and the same with all of these kind of fragments and shards of, I won't even call it culture, like TikTok. It's all designed to turn people into absolute morons, worse morons than they already are. Because I mean, the natural state of most humans is being a moron. But if you could turn them into puddles of slobbering, flesh that will giggle and laugh, at a fart, or crossed eyes, if that is the sort of ultimate state of of civilization, great, because those people will be even easier to sell to. So yeah, I mean, these are consequences, and again, I have very radical ideas about all of these things. I don't think that Elon Musk gasses on about democracy and free speech and advertising. These are not ideal end states of the West. So yeah, but we're stuck with it. We're stuck in this system for the moment.
Well, see, Mr. D, I'm in a very uncomfortable position because after railing against capitalism, now I have to read super chats where people have given me money to say.
Well, that's not really capitalism. I mean, again, I mean, well, it's difficult, isn't it? This is why you just say, I'm a postmodern traditionalist. I live in contradiction, and then you don't have to worry about it.
Well, I've considered myself God's least consistent soldier. It's like, yes, I'm aware this doesn't make sense. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah, we're all. I mean, again, we're all floating in the river, and we have no control other than to try to keep from going under. So yes, we are forced to put on the 3-piece suit and go to work. There's a Zen koan that's something like that. The world is large. Why do you put on a 3-piece suit? Something like that. It's a modern one because I don't think they had 3-piece suits back in the heady days of the Zen koan. But anyway, yeah, and yes, Western Sun, in the right circumstances, farts are funny. And there is no less a personage than Geoffrey Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales. Great figure in the genesis of Middle English literature, who literally makes fart jokes. So,
well, it was interesting. The school I went to I can't remember. There's a famous, I believe it's Victorian kind of, not modernization, but kind of like translation of Chaucer. And so some teacher had decided to read this to a group of 13 and 14-year-old students. And Chaucer is much like you said, it's a little bit racy by modern perspective. I'll put it that way. So, Mr.
I mean, you have a gentleman literally who puts a wig on his arse and leans it out the window for another man to kiss whilst he's shagging his wife, or his daughter. Yes. I can't remember.
One of those.
All right.
So we have a few super chats. Lost Remote says, "God bless D. Always warms my heart to hear him. Any word on the cookbook?"
the cookbook. No, I'm totally burnt out by the cookbook. Yeah, the people were sort of urging me. Well, first of all, I don't know what a right-wing cookbook is. I don't, I it's a joke, but I certainly don't. I don't think food is politically charged. The personal is the political. My hot dog is my manifesto. Okay.
Well, I think you should just make a very clearly delineated cookbook, right? Like, well, the mashed potatoes must be at least an inch away, like separate but equal, of course.
Exactly. You're going to learn how to make a white sauce.
We'll see, and it will perfectly it'll perfectly suit your audience by both satisfying the racist and the horribly autistic. All right, Farzang, appreciate the care and insight you guys bring to a contentious topic. Thank you very much. Son of Haster, who I got to meet in the flesh, very nice man. For the great chat, two of my favorites in this scene, and for Dee's fantastic avatar tonight. Yeah, I appreciated that. I also like how you have a new avatar for every appearance. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I like mix it up a bit, and of course every red-blooded American should know that is the real Star-Spangled Banner behind the octopus. Yeah, so it was in one of the Smithsonian museums, but it's the actual flag that was the subject of Francis Scott Key's poem.
Well, fair enough. And I should also say, this is inside baseball, but I appreciate that you sent your PFP in a usable resolution, because every once in a while I'll get one that's just NES.
Yeah.
It's
yes,
75
pixel square. Yeah, exactly. Also, by the way, very quickly, I should add that, of course, the Star Spangled Banner the lyric is a poem written by Francis Scott Key, but the music is a British drinking song, which actually came from a private society, basically sort of like a soft version of the Freemasons, called the Anacreonic Society, I believe. And so the name of that tune is called "To Anacreon in Heaven." To Anacreon in heaven, at Fugly. Yeah, I don't remember all the lyric, but yeah, look it up. It's quite interesting story. And again, your literal national anthem is a fusion, a consanguinity of the American and the British. We are brothers. We should never forget that.
Blood and Rain, the restoration of the British Empire and rearming of Japan would be to the benefit of the average American citizen, a co-manager for each ocean. I'll put it this way, all specifics aside, can you imagine anyone worse than who is currently in charge? I can't imagine the Japs would do any worse. Am I allowed to say that? Is that a slur?
It probably is. I typed the word Chinaman on Twitter, and I immediately got a pop-up that said this is hateful content. So,
to me, out of all of them, that is the slur that makes the least sense. That is a literal description. Anyway, that neither here nor there. Gunther Fellinger for Foreign Affairs Minister of the Burden Reich. I don't know who that is, so I'm just going to say I fully agree and endorse that sentence. No,
you don't want to. I don't know who he is. He's this man who's become a recent Twitter meme, but he I don't know that he works in some capacity for the EU or something, but he basically just goes around, he goes around the world and makes these tweets about how he thinks that here's how I'm going to carve up Saudi Arabia. Here's how I'm going to carve up Africa. Here's how I'm going to carve up America. It's this turbo postmodern NATO weirdness. I don't know what it is.
Never mind. My normal strategy of just agreeing to everything, it turns out to bit me in the ass here.
Yeah, be careful about it. That's like when you go to a foreign country and you don't speak the language, and someone says, just nod to everything. Not a good idea.
I'll take your word for it. Mutant number 12, coming late for the stream, went for a smoke, and the Browns approached me. Cannot go further. Sending money for upkeep and future camp productions. I don't know what you would mean, but I appreciate the money. John Carter for $5. D, if your home could only be furnished with either Picasso or Kincaid paintings, which would you choose?
I mean,
the Picasso's an amazing financial decision.
It doesn't. It doesn't. It doesn't need an answer to that. But yeah, I mean, if you want a tragedy, look up. Have you heard the tale of Darth Kincaid the Wise? No, look up the Thomas Kincaid story. Quite awful, and died in quite pitiful circumstances, and was a bit of a bastard from all accounts.
Well, I've opened that up on Wikipedia. I'll read it later.
Wretched pictures, but
Charlemagne for $5. Quote, food isn't politically charged, end quote. Me, fried chicken, watermelons, curry, dogs. I forgot to mention bats.
The bats!
I have no idea what you could mean at all. It seems to be just a collection of random foods. And then Lou Templar, I still love you, D.
Yeah.
Well, Mr. D, thank you so much for speaking with me. I really enjoyed it. So if people want to find more of your work, what's a good place to look for you?
Well, I mean, I think it's a bit of a laugh calling anything I do on the with this avatar work, but if you want to find things for me, there's always Twitter, which I'm at John D, and that's J in the old way, which is an IOHNDEE. So you can find my droppings there. I'm also, of course, appear most weeks on Unpopular Opinions as the co-host. Don't let AA convince you that I'm just some sort of like regular guest. I'm the co-host of UO. I will also be, if I may shill recent things, I will be doing the final part of the Francis Bacon streams about the British painter on Wednesday with Alexander Adams and AA, and I also will be appearing at some point soon on the Longhouse with a walrus, talking about food. Oh, so that's that. Yeah,
I'll tune into that. I've made no secret of the fact that Longhouse is one of my favorite shows to listen to. I think it's quite cozy. So be sure to check that out. As far as my stuff, you guys know where to find me. The show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. I should also say the YouTube channel is now just recently up to 4,000 subscribers, which, that's a pretty decent milestone for about a year and a half in. And also, I should say, if you want to support the channel, the best way to do that is to head over to AXIOS Fitness and use the code Beaver. You can join a workout program. You can see what I do. Mr. D, why are you laughing?
The Beaver. I love it. Yeah, we'll talk about it next time. But I own a taxidermized beaver.
Oh, I do.
Yeah. So
there's some phrasing that never mind. Anyway, so use the code Beaver. You'll be able to not only do the same workout that I do, see if I've actually been in the gym or if I've been lazy and skipping it. And I get a little kickback, nothing much, but it does help cover the cost of the show. And again, Mr. D, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Mr. Burden. It's always a great pleasure. Absolutely thrilled to be invited. And yes, as everyone who listens know, this is an excellent show. You're an excellent interlocutor, and I enjoy every minute of it.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. D. And everyone at home, remember, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.